Welcome everybody. It's 9:30, so we'll start. I'll keep admitting people as we go over the next few moments. Welcome to our 2021 Online Research Academy. We're very excited to be doing this online. Last year we had to cancel it because it was just at the start of lockdown. And I'm going to get straight into our first keynote so we stay on time. I'm really delighted to be able to introduce Dr. Vikram Kolmanskog. Vikram is a Gestalt therapist, a supervisor and professor at the Norwegian Gestalt Institute in Oslo. Among his therapy research interests are gender and sexuality diversity, climate change and ecology, and Buddhist and other spiritual practices, including mindfulness. Vikram also writes fiction and is the author of The Empty Chair, Tales from Gestalt Therapy, which is published by Routledge. I want to give a very warm welcome to Vikram today to deliver the first keynote address for our 2021 Metanoia Institute Research Academy. Please, if you'd like to ask questions or make comments throughout the presentation, could you use the chat function? I will be monitoring that and I will be passing on questions to Vikram at the end. We'll have a question and answer session, at which point people, if they want to, and time allowing, can ask some questions themselves in person, or if you don't want to do that, we can use some of the questions from the chat function. So we'll just have to see a little bit how much time we've got right at the end. But when we ran through Vikram's talk earlier on in the week, it lasts about 40-45 minutes, so we should have some time at the end for questions, and afterwards Vikram will be available, I think. So I'm going to hand over right away to Vikram to start sharing his screen, and over to you.
Thank you, Juliana. And good morning, everybody. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see my shared screen, the PowerPoint? Great, thank you. So good morning, my name is Vikram. I'm speaking to you from my apartment in Oslo, where I live with a partner. Snowy day here in Oslo today. In this keynote, I'll draw on two studies I've done, which are both available on my academia page. I'll also share some anecdotal experiences as a therapist, trainer, and researcher. And I'll invite you to reflect a bit through different exercises along the way. A recording of the presentation will be made available to you from Metanoia, so there's no need to frantically take notes unless that's your learning style, of course. It would be good if you have a pen and paper or your phone available for some of the reflections or to make some notes or drawings. And Juliana will help keep an eye on the chat, and we'll return to questions and comments that you put in there later. So let us start with a reflection. What assumptions do you already have about me, gender, sexuality, and relationship-wise? On the basis of what you've just heard and seen now, you can make some notes on your own piece of paper or phone. If you want to, you can also throw some words into the chat. Feel free. I'm inviting you to project on me. So Vikram is a I'm going to guess some of you assumed I'm a gay, monogamous man. Now take a moment to reflect on the process, how you've assumed. Consider, did you assume I have a sexuality and gender? Did you even consider that I could identify as asexual and agender? Did you consider that I could be a trans man or non-binary, neither identify as a man or a woman? Did you consider that my partner could be female and I bisexual? Or did you consider that I could have more than one partner? Many of these considerations may not even surface. We assume so implicitly and fast and according to certain dominant norms. This short exercise illustrates what we do in all meetings, including with clients, students, and research subjects. Later, I'll return to a study I did, which was related to this. This is how I currently identify. Homoflexible is a word I recently learned reading a study which presented how a lot of young people are now identifying, and there were so many non-traditional labels. This is one that resonated with me. I now invite you to take a brief moment and write down for yourself how you currently identify in terms of gender, sexuality, and relationship. So I am. You may want to adjust or nuance this as the talk progresses. For the remainder of the talk and afterwards, I invite you to continue to reflect on how your gender, sexuality, and relationship preference affects you and your perspective in the world. This is a word cloud that I've created, drawing on word clouds created with students and my wider social media community. I've also added some words in myself. Hundreds of more words could be included here. It's not in any way meant to be exhaustive, but I hope it reflects diversity. You may see some familiar words and labels and some less familiar. First and foremost, just notice what happens as you look at these. Is there judging, curiosity, shame, joy? For a long time, many people were seen as sick, sinful, or criminal. Even today, when I ask my students to do this exercise, there is almost always someone who will associate domination and other BDSM with trauma, or asexuality with trauma. I then point out that we do not pathologize straight vanilla sex in the same way, and research does not support the difference. It has to do with norms. When we meet a client, student, or research subject who belongs to a marginalized and historically pathologized group, we need to be aware of whether we expect their identity to be the issue. It may not be, and us assuming that it is may contribute to the marginalization and pathologizing. On the other hand, we should be aware that there can be much suffering connected with being straight, and not assume that this identity is unrelated to a client's issue. I'll return to this. A word of caution is also important when I present this word cloud. Some of the terms are originally slurs, but some people have reclaimed them and used them to self-identify. It's not necessarily okay for others to use the words. I would also like to invite you to notice whether you have an expectation that the terms will be explained to you. Could you yourself do some investigation? Perhaps write down some of the terms that you look up later. I also had to do some investigation to learn more about some of the labels and words that others had included in this word cloud. In terms of therapy, it may not be good practice to expect a client to educate us when they are paying for therapy. Rather, we can try to educate ourselves or refer to others. And at the same time, we can explore what a label means to a particular client. Some of the terms here belong to other languages and cultures than English and the Western world. I'm dual heritage with an Indian origin mother and Norwegian father. I added a few Indian terms such as hijra. Indian friends have added more. Some people reject as Western the labels lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans, and the LGBT acronym. A challenge within this field is that much has been done in an ethnicity vacuum, that it has been the white Western person who has been the standard without it being explicit. I'll return to issues of intersectionality later, and also just mention here that I will use the LGBT acronym. There is a set of norms that dominates Western society today, which is captured by the term heteronormativity. It violently narrows down what is acceptable in terms of gender, sexuality, and relationship. Many definitions exist, narrow or broad. This is mine. Man and woman, the only two genders that exist. They're fixed and essentially different. They are romantically and sexually attracted to each other, have sex of a certain kind. They're in a monogamous relationship / marriage, and hopefully get children. Heteronormativity is culturally specific. In other places and cultures, the norm is arranged marriage or polygamy. In India, a third gender has been recognized for thousands of years. British colonialization and criminalization has had its impact, however. Heteronormativity is also historically specific. For example, romantic love is relatively new also in the West. And for a long time, woman was really considered a somewhat deficient man. So really, there weren't two genders. Today, we could also say that there is less emphasis on marriage in much of the West. Still, who actually fits in this? Perhaps you want to consider for a moment how you fit and how you don't fit. While some people are very clearly marginalized, such as trans and bi and polyamorous people, even a straight man will struggle to live up to the norms and suffer. For example, gender norms dictate that he be rational and a breadwinner. What happens if he at some point feels vulnerable and expresses this? If he loses his job? Sexuality norms dictate that he should have only heterosexual desire and sex. What happens if he at some point has a same-sex fantasy or desire? My point is, heteronormativity actually limits everyone. Much heteronormativity is today expressed in a more covert way and often unconscious and unintentional. Less conscious attitudes can be revealed through tests developed by Project Implicit, one of the world's largest psychological experiments and studies. Even I, an open gay man who comes from a highly educated, progressive family and lives in one of the most gay-friendly countries in the world, received the following conclusion when I first tried the test. Your data suggest a strong automatic preference for straight people compared to gay people. This was an eye-opener to just how pervasive and internalized heteronormativity still is and how important it is to continue addressing this. When I took the test again a few years later, my result was very different. I recommend you do the test yourselves. You can also test other bias, including racism and sexism. It's uncomfortable, but important. Heteronormativity is not just something out there. I think it's a free-floating phenomena that appears in any one of us at different times. Queer theory challenges heteronormativity. It may in fact challenge all norms and labels. Queer originally meant odd or strange. It was used as a slur for gay men and then reclaimed. It's a contested term. These are some of my favorite definitions. Whatever is at odds with the normal, the legitimate, the dominant, a positionality vis-a-vis the normative. Not simply a resistance to the norm, but protesting against the idea of normal behavior. And the meaning is and should remain unclear, fluid, and multiple. Sometimes queer is described as anti-normative, but I think queer itself involves certain values, such as diversity and fluidity. Also, anti seems to me to be a very reactive position to be in, very tangled up in the dynamic we are allegedly trying to change. I think it's very human to resort to norms and judging. What is meant by queer is in fact often policed informally, and people challenging queer orthodoxy are dismissed as, for example, essentialist or simplistic. We should be aware of this tendency. Thereby, we may be able to maintain a more generous queer position. We can also have an aspiration to cultivate a generous queer position by keeping the meaning of queer open, unclear, and unstable. I like to think of queer as a verb rather than a stable noun. To queer can mean to explore and look for fluidity and diversity, to destabilize taken for granted things and power relations, to be playful and see various possibilities. This sort of queerness has been criticized by people involved in identity politics activism, where the category and label of LGBT is important. We now have LGBT rights, and many of us are very happy about that. Queerness has also been criticized by people who emphasize that some comfort is found in identities, that labels can be a stabilizing factor for people. Personally, I have a rather pragmatic approach to this. I want both labels and queerness. I sometimes identify as gay or homoflexible. At other times, I'll emphasize queerness, depending on context and purpose. Let us now take a brief look at psychotherapy's mixed legacy in this field. Sigmund Freud, when he wrote about normal sexuality, put normal in quotation marks. And he had the following to say about homosexuality. All are capable of making a homosexual object choice and have in fact made one in their unconscious. However, this should be sublimated into the love of mankind in general. Still, Freud was radical for his time, and probably too radical when we look at his successors, who pathologized everything that was not normal. Up until the mid-90s, psychoanalytic training institutes in the UK did not accept people who identified as anything but heterosexual. Homosexuality has been a diagnosis until 1973 in the DSM, until 1990 in the ICD. The trans experience was considered a diagnosis until 2013 in the DSM, until 2018 in the ICD. Asexuality, BDSM, and many other ways of being gendered and sexual have also been pathologized and still are to some extent. Gestalt therapy and other humanistic modalities have a somewhat different history. These are the words of one of Gestalt's co-founders, Paul Goodman, who was openly bisexual. I'm degraded for being myself. Goodman, who was white, compares being queer with the plight of Black people in the US. But he himself reports that Stokely Carmichael blandly put us down by saying that we could always conceal our disposition and pass. This resonates with me. I can pass as straight, but I cannot pass as white among other white people. And part of heteronormativity is related to this exact issue. Most people are assumed to be heterosexual, and certain groups or aspects of people are made invisible or less visible. I want to also take this opportunity to say something more about the intersection of sexuality on the one hand and race and ethnicity on the other. As a queer brown man, the gay community in Oslo or London or elsewhere in the West is not always a safe and accepting community. I'm currently supervising a master's student who is doing an autoethnography of what it is like to be a Black gay person and therapist in the UK. There are some heartbreaking experiences that he recounts, including how he is reduced to a fetish in a gay club. In a therapy group, he says out loud that he's aware of himself being the only Black person. Later, he tells me that he realizes it was too much to also come out as gay there. I'm certain it matters in our supervision relationship that I too am a queer person of color. Intersections of identities pose particular problems and privileges. Now let's return to Goodman and Gestalt therapy. Gestalt therapy has from the start had queer people, such as Paul Goodman, in prominent positions, and there is nothing in Gestalt theory per se that is heteronormative as far as I can see. Quite the opposite. Queerness may have influenced Gestalt therapy, as we see from this next quote from Goodman's text. My plight has given energy to my anarchism, utopianism, and Gandhianism. Goodman writes about how being queer and an outsider has inspired him to want a more elementary humanity, wider, more variegated, less structured, and where people pay more attention to one another. Many therapies today have no explicitly heteronormative models and theories. Most therapies today are changing for the better. Conversion therapy is against good practice in the UK and elsewhere. And I should mention too that many psychoanalysts today have made great efforts in developing and providing LGBTQ positive and affirming therapy, and I've drawn myself upon this in my work. And yet, trainers, therapists, and researchers are also part of the wider societal field where there is still much bias, despite rapidly changing attitudes. And much is unconscious and implicit, as I already illustrated with my own test results from Project Implicit. A recent doctoral thesis from the US suggests that LGBT students in counselor education programs experience a range of microaggressions. And there are several studies showing how heteronormativity plays out in the therapy room. In order to explore and address heteronormativity in therapy training, I carried out an experiment, somewhat similar to what I started this presentation with when I asked you about your assumptions about me. You can read about it in detail in a paper available at academia. Here I can only speak briefly about it. I carried out the experiment during a 3-day training with Gestalt therapy students at the Norwegian Gestalt Institute. In this group, 12 identified as women and 4 as men. Everyone was white except for me. On the morning of the second day, I asked the group to divide into 2 groups, clients and therapists. I asked the clients to go out and wait outside the room. I told the therapists that they would receive a client and work with that person in therapy for 15 minutes. I then went outside to the clients and gave them some instructions. I told them to think of someone they felt some attraction towards, a person of the same gender as themselves or another gender. They should find a therapist and then talk about the attraction and situation. They should do this while trying to not disclose the person's gender, for example, by avoiding gender-specific pronouns. I'll now share some of the observations and reflections that emerged from this experiment and the conversation in class that followed. The instruction to avoid disclosing the gender of the person they were attracted to had an effect on many of the students who had been clients. One woman reported the following: "It was very difficult to avoid pronouns in the conversation. I had to search for words and formulations. It led to a distancing." What she describes is not very different from what many of us who are LGBT and queer experience. Perhaps this experiment helped those students who don't identify as LGBT or queer to empathize more. Another finding was that many therapists hadn't expressed any heteronormative assumptions, and this had an important effect on the clients. One man reported, "I spoke about attraction to persons outside of my current relationship. The therapist never got to know the gender of these, the persons in or outside the current relationship. It felt good to be met as I was, without anything being added concerning gender." This may be understood in light of Gestalt's strong emphasis on phenomenology. As one student reported, "With phenomenology, I avoid adding anything to the client's story that is not there." However, it also became clear that several clients had experienced their therapist making assumptions. One man reported, "I experienced that the therapist concluded and mistook the gender of the person that I spoke about. I felt a weak sense of irritation when I felt judged about something the therapist had no way of knowing anything about." The experiment understandably triggered shame in students who had been therapists and later realized that they had made heteronormative assumptions. I tried to normalize the phenomenon and reduce the shame, clarify that this is a field phenomenon, that it's not that we're individually bad or guilty, and at the same time that we can try to increase our awareness. One student who had been a therapist reported the following: "I became aware of introjection, how influenced I too am by the field phenomenon in our society, heteronormativity, how easy it is to assume." Let's now move to another study that I've done. Again, I can only speak briefly about it here and refer you to the paper available at academia if you're interested in knowing more. This is a case study of a transgender therapy group I facilitated in Oslo in 2013. The group was mixed in terms of ethnicity, sexuality, gender, age, class, and with regards to other identity markers. One key finding was the importance of phenomenology. Alex defined himself as F to M, that is, he was registered as female at birth and experienced himself more as male at the time of the group. Prior to the first session, Alex approached me with a consent form, wondering if he should write his real name. And I answered that he could write both. He wrote Alexandra in block letters. Soon after the group started, Alex wrote me an email about very big steps he'd taken because of the group, including coming out to family, friends, and colleagues, undertaking a process to change his name officially, and contacting a gender clinic abroad. He signed with Alexander. From then on, we all used the name Alexander. Kennedy, who was another group participant, identified as genderqueer and fluid. In talking about Kennedy during a session, I said she, corrected myself to he, then to Kennedy, and apologized. It was nice that you corrected it. That's the first time it's happened, said Kennedy with a big smile. A phenomenological approach, including mirroring, witnessing, and validating in connection with how each person identified themselves, and in particular with the use of names and pronouns, was experienced by the participants as supportive and transformative. The group as a whole, not merely me as a therapist, was rather phenomenological in that everyone, to a large extent, respected the subjective realities and experiences of the others. The episode with Kennedy, wherein I used he and she before correcting and apologizing, was an accidental experiment. My apology involved a deep respect for Kennedy's gender identity as experienced by Kennedy. On the post-therapy feedback form, Kennedy reported it as a crucial event. Much later, during a copy editing prior to print, the wording was changed so wrong pronouns appear in the printed paper. I was very upset about this, and the editor apologized but said it was too late. I've corrected the version on academia by just striking out pronouns, as you can see. I mention this here because it shows how heteronormativity and implicit bias shows up everywhere, including anywhere in a research and publication process. Another main finding from this group was the value of polarity theory. According to the Gestalt view of the self and growth, different sides in a person or larger system are complementary and connected like yin and yang, rather than seen as dichotomies. Due to our culture and upbringing and other experiences, however, we typically have blind spots, sides we're less aware of and identify less with. And this may entail intrapersonal conflict as well as interpersonal conflict because, for example, we project a disowned side onto another person. Joe, who was a trans man in the group, at one point shared that whereas before treatment he had experienced anxiety related to not being a gender norm conforming woman, now it was related to not being a standard man. He had a sense of loss and wanted to be able to live out an androgynous side more. I noticed he was wearing clothes that created for me associations with the military or wildlife, and I asked if he could at some point dress in a more androgynous way here with us. At the next session, Joe had brought some clothes that he changed into during a break and then joined us in a long, colorful shirt, earrings, and sandals. During a dialogue, he expressed the following. It's like saying hello to an old feeling that is also part of me. And that is probably the androgynous part. It feels like a joy because I feel safe enough with you. Joe continued to say that he had some friends with whom he might also feel safe enough to do this. He told us that he was, on the one hand, the colorful disco queen that we were seeing now, and on the other, a military-inspired SM man. At this point, I engaged in some psychoeducation on polarities as this is understood in Gestalt. This episode illustrates how polarities, gender norms, and introjection may interact. One side may be oppressed at one point in life as a woman, and the other side at another point in life as a man. Suffering can be understood in terms of the weaknesses of society, its low tolerance for gender diversity, rather than as an issue of individual pathology. In our group, we recognized and explored social pressures and choice, broke gender norms in a safe setting, and explored how that felt. A military-inspired SM man could also be a colorful disco queen. Others in the group also found polarities to be a useful concept. For example, Alexander reported that it helped him own that he could be both assertive and caring. Qualities some psychologists have described as respectively masculine and feminine, but that I avoid gendering like that. I now invite you to do a brief reflection that you may want to continue working on more later. For now, quickly fill in 3 qualities that you identify with, such as kind or hardworking. Then I want you to think about what might be the opposite and whether you're in touch with that and how you view that quality. You may also want to think about how you identify in terms of gender, sexuality, and relationship diversity, and how that influences what you're aware of and own, and what you disown, repress, and possibly project onto others. The concepts of polarities and continua may be helpful more generally in exploring gender, sexuality, and relationship diversity. According to some, we're not either a man or a woman, but find ourselves somewhere on this continuum, and exactly where may vary over time for some of us. Some studies indicate that around half of young people do not identify as exclusively hetero or homo. Maybe you want to reflect yourself about where you are on these continua, where you are now. I also want to share that as I created this presentation, I suddenly noticed that heteronormativity even showed up here in a subtle manner. Look at what I put down first, on the left side, perhaps subtly indicating a standard, norm, and privileging. Man, heterosexual, and monoromantic, monosexual, or monogamous, as we often say. Having become aware of it, I can at least change the order around for us here. Let's now continue with some points to consider for queering training. Again, I'm not intending any of this to be exhaustive. Does your institute express that they want gender, sexuality, and relationship diversity? Not least when advertising for new students to apply? And is this something that you're aware of as you interview students, recruit trainers, and other staff? I'm explicit with colleagues as well as students. I talk about my male partner. I'm clearly queer. I think it's important that I, in my position as professor, do this. It's important to break heteronormativity as much as we can. I also try to be aware of how I interact with students and colleagues, whether I'm assuming something or not. In the class that I started up last autumn, I noticed that I was assuming something about gender identity through pronoun use, as some were presenting themselves. So I checked and then encouraged everyone to include which pronoun they preferred. This way of presenting oneself has become quite normal and often seen as good practice. I myself prefer he or him. I'm also fine with they and them. The spaces we move in also matter, not least toilets. The Norwegian Gestalt Institute used to have the traditional toilet signs with a woman and man. In 2015, I was going to have a book launch at the Institute. In that connection, I printed some new signs that said toilets for everyone and put over the traditional signs. When the launch was finished, I didn't take them down, and the administration also left them up. Now, in the new building of the Institute, the toilets simply have a sign that says toilet. I mention this for two reasons. One, I think you need to think about toilets and the training space more generally. Second, I'd like to invite you to open to the various ways you can queer training, the Institute, and the world around you. I didn't make a big deal about the toilet signs with the Institute and the administration. I just changed them for my book launch, and then the change had been introduced. Historically, there's been a lack of training in this field in many psychotherapy institutes. In this talk, I've presented two of my own studies. There are many others by other researchers. And in one of my studies, I offered an experiment that I hope many institutes may consider including. Finally, I want to say that what we're exploring here concerns norms, privilege, and change, so any exploration can easily trigger guilt, shame, and resistance. Some of you may have noticed some of that during the talk today as well. We need to be aware and prepared for that, not least to support these processes. Since this can be a very personal issue for me, it can be difficult to balance my own strong process and others. I need to also focus on self-care and support, not least consider how much and when I do want to raise these issues. When understood correctly, this should really be an issue that everyone has an interest in raising and exploring, not least straight men who, as I mentioned earlier, also suffer from heteronormativity. I now want to share some suggestions and reflections for you as researchers, what queering may entail for you. Again, this is not meant to be exhaustive and a list to check off. You may also want to continue to reflect on some of these questions later. The erotic is emphasized by many different queer scholars, including Audre Lorde, a queer of color poet, essayist, activist, woman, and mother. In the essay Uses of the Erotic, which is one of my favorite essays by Audre Lorde, she speaks of the erotic as a feeling sensation and life force, something that has been repressed in all of us, and something that is radical and transgressive because it entails asking what we actually enjoy. And it encourages us to follow our joy rather than to comply like robots with externally defined demands of a patriarchal system. As a researcher and professor, I can regularly get caught in this system, thinking about academic status, performing, producing. When I was asked to do this keynote, I could feel some anxiety and some of this being triggered. I then decided to enjoy the preparation. Otherwise, why do it? I have enjoyed reading up, creating a presentation, and now speaking to you. I've enjoyed supportive conversations with Juliana from Metanoia along the way, as well as conversations with other colleagues and friends. I'd also encourage you to investigate these questions for yourselves in your work and research. What do you desire? Are you enjoying your work? And what is the place of the erotic? Much queer research focuses on minorities, but there is also queer research that looks at heterosexuality and normativity more generally, as I believe has become somewhat clear from this talk. So questions to also ask yourselves may include the following. Exploring experiences of sexual gender relationship minorities, is this something that you're doing? Are you queering heterosexuality? And how does your research engage with taken for granted meanings and power relationships? A queer perspective and outlook may, as I've already introduced, involve an appreciation of diversity and fluidity. This is related to ontology and has effects on epistemology and methodology. When people are fluid, how can we gather data? How do we make meaning of these data? And what is the relationship between researcher and researched? Much of my own work follows a relational and phenomenological approach. The research participants become more like co-researchers, and I'm also deeply influenced by them. I think many methods can be queer. Queer lives can be addressed through a plethora of methods, and all methods can be put to the task of questioning normativities. Generally, however, you'll find that most queer research is qualitative. Many queer researchers would question how we can count and compare when we are all fluid. Queer scholars can argue for the playful possibilities of unstable and indeterminate subjectivities and for transgressive practices that challenge heteronormativity. But this may in itself also be a privileged position. For some, their identities are a matter of life or death. My supervisee, who is Black and gay in the UK, is aware that some want to kill him because of his skin color and his sexual orientation. It's important to consider intersectionality, have an understanding of intersections of class, age, ethnicity, and other identity markers. Queer research is a way of knowing that is a situated inquiry that relates to specific ways of knowing in particular locations. But it should be mentioned here that much queer research itself has failed to do this properly. Much queer theorizing has originated in the global north, and it often leaves unrecognized the situatedness of academics from the global north, whilst those from elsewhere are bound to their location. Queering may not be easy and may challenge dominant norms within academia. The academy increasingly embraces queer contingencies while simultaneously requiring specific rules of rigor, clarity, and truthfulness. For example, the editors of a book on queer methods had problems with the peer review because they refused to clearly define queer. I'll end my presentation with this overview of some open access resources that may be helpful, including the book with the queer methods, the bottom one you see here. If my talk has sparked an interest, I do have some free capacity for supervision and assessment on master and doctoral levels, so feel free to reach out to me by email. Thank you for your attention so far, and now I'm looking forward to any questions and comments.
Thank you